Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Tomasello. I'm a land use planner with RRM Design Group. Excited to have you all here to join us today for this workshop on the fact and fiction of infill multifamily housing. As we all know, housing development is a very hot topic right now. It's considered a crisis in California, and that's true in many respects. The costs to rent, own, and build housing have continued to rise and are at all-time highs. There are over 150,000 people currently without homes in California, which is up nearly 20% since 2007. And over half of California's renters are considered rent burdened, meaning they spend more than a third of their disposable income on housing costs. In Santa Barbara, where the median home price is nearly 1.2 million, tens of thousands of people who work in our community have to live outside of the area, where housing costs are often 100 to 200% lower on average, according to studies by SBCAG. And this creates a host of issues, from traffic congestion and air emissions to the economic and social loss created when they leave our communities every evening. The issues related to housing or lack of housing are not easily remedied. They're bigger than what a single individual, neighborhood, or even city are able to fully solve on its own. They're immensely complex, and they're created by more factors than any one law or policy can fix. And they're often simply transferred to neighboring areas or allowed to slip through the cracks when they're addressed without a collective effort of an entire region. But these issues still affect each and every person within a community to varying extents, and sooner or later they escalate to a point which begins to diminish the quality of life that we all strive for every day. These issues are true externalities, or the unintended consequences of a system of economic, political, and regulatory land development and other decisions we've made that take a collaborative and collective effort to work toward improving. In doing so, we know the state of California has decided to step in. It's passed dozens of laws in recent years aimed at increasing the production of housing of all different shapes and sizes. From accessory dwelling units on single-family zone properties to permanent supportive housing for the homeless and those with mental health disabilities. Many of these new state laws are in some form intended to remove the decision of what housing goes where from local politics because of the negative consequences this approach has created on our broader community. This top-down approach has resulted in additional housing units, and in my experience, it's significantly reduced the ability for local agencies to deny or otherwise render infeasible housing developments of all kinds. And it's not an easy pill to swallow for many community members and local decision makers. But it does beg the question, is this one-size-fits-all approach the most appropriate solution? We all likely know the term NIMBY, or the sentiment that, sure, housing is great and important and serves a need, but I don't want it in my neighborhood. And while sometimes this may seem like an easy label to put on anyone who has anything negative to say about housing, and I'm certainly guilty of that at times, as a planner, I still think it's important to listen to these concerns, explore their validity and origin, and reflect on whether there's something we should be doing better, so that when we say we're improving a neighborhood with a project, we truly mean it and we can say it with confidence. In this spirit, I'm excited to be here today, joined by a few professionals with very broad experience in distinct fields to explore some of the most common assumptions and preconceptions we all make about housing and its impacts on our communities, particularly surrounding economic and community development, traffic and parking, and water and land use policy. While we can't ignore the political and regulatory framework surrounding housing development, I want to dive deeper and try to understand these types of real concerns a bit better, challenge some of our assumptions, and explore whether there are things we can and should be doing to minimize any unintended consequences of this more top-down approach to addressing the housing crisis within our South Coast region. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists to first introduce themselves and their backgrounds and explain what some of the most common concerns they hear on a regular basis are, and how we start to try to get to the root of some of these concerns in order to analyze the real impact of housing on our communities. So Jason, why don't you get us started?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the conference. My name is Jason Harris. I'm the City of Santa Barbara's Economic Development Manager. This is a newly created position in the city, and I'm a newly hired employee. I'm focused on supporting businesses and downtown revitalization by working with developers, businesses, and stakeholders in providing assistance in the permitting process, policy, project, and infrastructure implementation. I've held similar positions in the city of Santa Monica and Phoenix, where I saw firsthand how infill residential development played a large part of the revival and vibrancies of those downtowns and helped further economic growth and prosperity. Up until the last decade or so, cities have been slow to adjust the land use regulations to respond to the increased demand and need for infill housing that adequately addresses the cost and challenges of developing this residential type. Local opposition to the physical change of a community, be it height, density, displacement, noise, or traffic, have slowed adoption of land use policies that recognize the opportunity and need of infill housing. Overlay the growing trend for the past decade of decreasing housing inventory in short supply, not keeping up with the demand with population growth, resulting in rising home values. This market condition only fueled the jobs to housing imbalance in many communities, as well as increased the cost burden of housing on a large number of residents and led to the deteriorating housing conditions in many communities. Ultimately, the lack of housing supply is one of the most pressing issues affecting quality of life, the opportunity for economic prosperity, and upward economic mobility for a growing number of Californians. Thank you.
Scott, we'll go to you next, please.
Well, thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everybody out there in Zoom land. My name is Scott Schell, and I'm a principal with Associated Transportation Engineers, a traffic consulting firm located here in Santa Barbara. My general experience includes a background in transportation planning theory, traffic engineering operations, environmental impact analyses, as well as parking policy and design. I've been working in the fields of transportation engineering and transportation planning for over 37 years, and I've participated in a wide variety of residential mixed-use projects located throughout Santa Barbara, Ventura, and San Luis Obispo counties. My role on the panel today will be to discuss the link between transportation and parking policies and the development of higher density infill housing. I'll be reviewing the new CEQA transportation impact thresholds related to vehicle miles traveled that were ushered in by SB 743 and talk about how those new policies and thresholds affect infill housing development in the future. I'll also provide some background on how parking policies can affect the development cost of infill housing, and then finally touch on some current transportation mobility trends that will help foster future development of infill housing as well on the South Coast. So on to slide one. As many of you know that are working in the planning world today, the new CEQA transportation thresholds, which were required as of July 1st of this year, had shifted from the old standard of analyzing roadway and intersection levels of service, congestion and delay, to a new metric of vehicle miles traveled. One of the stated main goals of SB 743 is to promote a course of long-term sustainability based on denser infill development, reduced reliance on individual vehicles, and improved mass transit, all with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Really, the new CEQA thresholds are specifically designed to promote denser infill housing near transit hubs and along transit corridors. Under SB 743, it's estimated that over 50% of development within the state could forego transportation analysis and mitigation entirely, thus streamlining the development of infill housing. These include affordable housing developments, developments located within a half a mile of a transit corridor, projects that generate fewer than 110 trips per day, as well as new housing located in existing areas of low VMT, which can be found really in every region of the state, including both rural and suburban locations. Next slide. So as I touched upon, parking standards and policies can have a big impact on the production and cost of infill housing as well. Most current parking standards are designed to ensure that all new residents have a dedicated place for their vehicles without creating negative spillover effects on public parking in the surrounding areas. These parking requirements can have an unintended consequence of increasing the cost of infill housing by increasing the amount of land required for the development, and as well as increasing the cost per unit with the provision of structured or underground parking. This is particularly true for development of multifamily housing in urban infill areas where structured or underground parking can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 a space. This is a significant cost factor which leads to higher rents. In many cases, the minimum parking requirements also go beyond what may actually be needed and can encourage higher vehicle ownerships as well as increased driving, congestion, and pollution. Jurisdictions seeking to expand the supply of housing are re-examining their zone. I'm kind of choking up here. Can we just cut there for a sec? Yep. Okay, jurisdictions seeking to expand the supply of housing are re-examining their zoning code to determine whether the current minimum parking requirements can be reduced in certain areas or for certain types of developments. By reducing off-street parking, communities can lower development costs, potentially free up additional land for units, and reduce the cost of housing for residents. Last slide, last two slides, a quick brush up on transportation and mobility trends. Current transportation and mobility trends will also influence how we develop infill housing in the future. Many of you have heard about the trend of younger millennials and workforce employees owning fewer vehicles and embracing alternative transportation lifestyles such as car sharing, ride sharing, telecommuting, using transit and bicycles for commuting. This younger workforce, as well as older retired and semi-retired individuals, are also choosing to live in more compact, walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods. These trends continue to, in the future, they're going to increase the demand for infill housing as well. Last slide on this set. Another trend that is influencing mobility in a positive way for infill housing is the Complete Streets movement. Complete Streets is a transportation policy and design approach that requires streets be planned, designed, and operated and maintained to ensure access and travel for all users and ages. The policy helps to ensure streets balance the need of different modes and support local land uses, economies, and cultures. The Complete Streets design approach is ideally suited for areas where higher density infill housing is being proposed. So I'm going to switch it back to Tony.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. That's a really, really great background. Mack, we'll go to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mack Carlson. I'm an associate attorney with Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck, a local law firm. I practice water, natural resources, and land use law, representing both private developers and local agencies across the state. Prior to law school, I was a hydrogeologist at a water utility company in Southern California, and I was born and raised here in Santa Barbara. Today, if you could go to my presentation, that would be great. Today, I will be focusing on water supply and infrastructure challenges. However, I'd like to note that similar issues arise with other types of municipal services, including wastewater and other utility provisions. Before I begin in earnest, however, I must start with the token attorney disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation are my personal opinions and do not reflect any of the opinions of my firm or any of my clients. Can we go to the next slide? So leaning into the theme for this presentation, I wanted to start out with a few facts for everyone. According to this, I'll start first with the housing crisis. According to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, over the last 10 years, the state averaged fewer than 80,000 new homes, while the projected needs for the state were approximately 180,000 additional homes annually. This represents a shortfall of over 1 million homes over that 10-year period. At the legislative level, the state has added some new requirements to the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Program, or RHNA, which is a program that allocates the share of housing to different counties across the state. In Santa Barbara County, the state released a new draft allocation for 2023 through 2031 and is requiring more than 29,300 housing units between that period. That's a 166% increase compared to the previous regional housing needs allocation cycle between 2015 and 2023, which the county and cities in the county failed to meet by approximately 35%. The state's also been active in updating RHNA. Previously, it was a paper tiger, essentially, but recent legislation allows the state to withhold grant funding and institute legal action against cities that fail to provide sufficient housing. Turning to water efficiency and its interplay with housing issues, I just want to highlight a few facts regarding the efficiency of new development to set the stage for my remarks. Between 2000 and 2015, per capita water demand decreased despite the increase in population and the construction of new housing. California first adopted standards for appliance water efficiency called Title 20 in 1976. However, almost 2/3 of the state's residential buildings were constructed prior to the adoption of these standards. In 2015, the California Energy Commission adopted more aggressive water efficiency standards for indoor appliances for all new development and for requiring retrofits for buildings constructed prior to 1994. However, many of these buildings have yet to be retrofitted. New homes in general are about 2 times more efficient than older homes, and this level is even more higher for infill development. The infographic I have here at the bottom depicts the anticipated savings from these new indoor efficiency standards, and estimates that it's approximately 105 billion gallons per year, or about 3 times the amount of water used for the city of San Francisco. Infill development is even more efficient than new development in the suburbs. In terms of water infrastructure, I want to highlight a couple of issues related to financing of water infrastructure. As you may be aware, Proposition 13 and other limitations on local property taxes force local developments into extracting development impact fees in order to help balance their budget. Today, up to 1/3 of California cities' budgets are composed of development-related fees, and the largest category of these fees are related to water, sewer, electric, and gas requirements. These fees result in infrastructure costs for projects ranging between 15 to 20% of the new development. And finally, California's development fees were approximately 3 times higher than the national average. So transitioning to my next slide, I'd like to highlight a couple fictions that I think we'll be touching on in this presentation today. The first is that water supply should dictate land use decisions. Hopefully this is clear from my remarks regarding water efficiency, especially for new infill development. But it's important to note that water efficiency metrics really encourage new development rather than maintaining old development patterns. The second fiction is that local governments do not employ water supply and infrastructure concerns to limit new development. I think it's well known, at least in the Central Coast, that certain agencies rely on water supply issues to deny new development. One example is Goleta Water District in the city of Goleta. I'm happy to dive into their issues a little bit further as we discussed, but they have an ordinance that's taken effect that was adopted by voters in 1991, which sets forth conditions that the district must meet in order to approve new water connections. So this effectively helps limit new development within the city of Goleta by the water district. Lastly, I'll turn to a third fiction. The government should rely solely on new development to finance infrastructure. I think as we're well aware at both the federal, state, and local level, aging infrastructure is a chronic issue across the U.S., and new development through development impact fees cannot and should not solely be responsible for all the deferred maintenance that the existing homeowners and residents are benefiting from by the failure to maintain infrastructure. And we can discuss, hopefully discuss further some potential solutions to these problems.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And thanks again for being here and for all your time and efforts on this workshop. So taking a little bit of a step back. So I personally got into this industry in large part because I believed that the way we have developed here on the Central Coast and growing up was unsustainable and posed significant problems for the natural and built environment. So I studied green building materials and methods, and really kind of dove into that industry. And I soon realized that it was more than just what goes into a building, but really about where it's placed, the context of where it's located, and other larger factors dealing with higher level land use policy. And one of the things I've always found interesting is that a lot of how we got to where we are here on the Central Coast is because of the environmental movements of the mid to late 20th century. However, our understanding of what development is good or bad for our region, particularly with respect to housing, has taken nearly a complete 180-degree turn from the type of preservationist or slow growth ideas that were really strong at that time toward a much more smart growth type of an approach. So I was hoping that you guys can talk a little bit about why you think that is from your perspectives, and maybe Scott, we'll start with you, please.
I'd love to, Tony. I totally agree with that sentiment, having worked in the community for over 30 years. Certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a pretty good shift in policies specifically related to infill housing. If you could pull up the next slide, the city of Santa Barbara's average unit density, or AUD program, is a really good example of that. The city has identified certain areas that have good transit service, walkable mixed-use neighborhoods, where infill housing would be promoted through providing higher densities. This is a map showing one of the more recent reviews of the AUD program at the Planning Commission hearing. The AUD program took it a step further by also reducing parking requirements for the infill developments, thus allowing higher densities and lower costs of construction. One of the other key movements that happened at that time was the city updated the general plan. As part of that general plan update, they adopted overriding considerations for traffic impacts for the entire city. That really streamlined the review and approval of these AUD projects. So the program was extremely successful. We saw more residential infill units built in the last 2 or 3 years than we have in the last 2 decades in the city of Goleta. There was kind of a parallel program that also occurred in the city of Goleta, before. The city took a general plan amendments to rezone several commercial industrial properties along the Hollister Avenue transit corridor to infill housing, higher density, and mixed use developments. The result of those rezones produced over 1,000 units of infill housing over the last 5 years or so within the city of Goleta. So certainly seeing the shift and part of it here on the South Coast.
Great, thank you. Mack, why don't we go to you next?
Sure. I think what you've highlighted is the environmental concerns of the community of Santa Barbara and the Central Coast, and using those concerns to leverage reduced development. I think in this period, we've realized that new development doesn't necessarily have to be more demanding on water supply due to the increased efficiency of appliances, and that the slow growth mindset actually has some serious externalities associated with forcing members of the community to live farther away and to commute into work, and that has had corresponding economic impacts to the community itself. So I think it's kind of a misnomer, and it's been a misconception that growth is inherently damaging to the environment that we all cherish. So I'd like to see our opinions evolve about how growth can factor into a sustainable community and make improvements to the quality of life here on the Central Coast.
Absolutely, thanks, Mack. And Jason, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just augment my colleagues' remarks here. If additionally, kind of environmental and other broad civic benefits, I think the context of revitalization being a tool that infill housing, refill housing, where there's a change of the physical form and use, can have really substantive impacts to the community, not only into creating a new tax base, tax value opportunities, but creating new consumers in market areas where we did not necessarily have residents directly located, and that then creates a new mix of use and activity that just helps further revitalization efforts. The status quo I think we've seen specifically in commercial corridors, is not a healthy trend in the long term. Property owners don't necessarily continue the investment of the property. The change of use has ancillary benefits to adjacent properties and overall benefits to the community at large.
Great, thank you guys. an interesting question. I think we started with that one for a reason, but I obviously think we're kind of preaching to the choir a little bit with those who may be attending this conference. I'm curious to know your thoughts of, these are not new principles. I think smart growth and these types of changes that have been needed have been around for quite some time. But do you think that it was necessary for the state to step in and kind of force the issue a little bit? And what have been the biggest changes that you've seen from your perspectives and in your respective industries? Why don't we start with Mack, please?
Sure, great. I think that's a great question. I would start just by highlighting that, the state's been pretty active in new legislation that sort of targets local agencies' discretion to deny or condition housing projects that would render them infeasible. They've also, through the state density bonus law, encouraged increase in density of use, particularly in infill areas and areas with mass transit. These are pretty prescriptive approaches that cities are struggling to meet the demands of. They require, large updates to their general plan, to their zoning code to accommodate this new type of development. And it can add to a lot of frustration on behalf of developers who want to seek to leverage these laws. However, really, local agencies are just trying to look out in the best interests of their community and leverage, the values of the community into an effective zoning code. So to the extent that local agencies can take steps towards adopting new ordinances that do not conflict or that encourage or go farther than state law, I think that would be immensely beneficial. But it is certainly a challenge that are putting sort of tension between local agencies, developers, and members of the public who may not understand where all these new requirements are coming from. So it's something that I think will present a challenge for the foreseeable future as elected officials and the public attempt to reconcile the new requirements under state law.
Absolutely. Jason, your thoughts?
No, Mack really summarized well. I mean, ultimately, to kind of break it down a little more explicitly, I think it obviously motivates local policymakers and it rationalizes for the community at large, both for residents and local policymakers, the need for proactive local control. If left unaddressed, ultimately, these state mandates will carry the day, and maybe there's local development that's not necessarily what's idealized or envisioned in the community. So I think Santa Barbara is an example of that with the AUD program of establishing that and then further updating that program to respond to some of those earlier comments that not only is there a need for additional housing, but there's also additional civic and community needs to help revitalize certain sections of the community, be thoughtful to where infrastructure investment is made to maximize collective benefit. So I think the stick approach that the state is taking is somewhat motivating. Ultimately, I think we would be hoping and looking forward for some carrots to also be offered. And I think there's some questions coming forward later on the session about financing tools, because I think there's a big missing element there in that regard.
Definitely. Thanks, Jason. Scott?
I'm going to talk about this from a specific transportation angle, and some of the key elements that we've seen come from the state regarding transportation really came out of the climate action plans and greenhouse gas emission plans that were born in 2008 and beyond. And out of those plans, we got SB 743, which is now a part of CEQA, and that was really designed to allow local jurisdictions a more streamlined approach to approving and developing affordable infill housing. And so if you pull up the first slide, one of the big aspects of SB 743 is it says that affordable housing is a good thing in an infill environment. It generates a lot less VMT than market rate housing. And jurisdictions can have the ability of saying, we don't have a significant CEQA impact or mitigation requirement for affordable housing. So kind of a big CEQA out for that particular SB 743. The next one, there's also a transit priority out, and we've talked about that in the introduction of my speech. We could see the next slide. Residential projects that are located within a half a mile of a transit priority route can be found to have less than significant impacts for transportation. And what does that mean for our area? This is the transit priority map, and as you can see, it really includes the whole part of Goleta through Santa Barbara along the State Street Hollister Avenue corridors, as well as the majority of downtown Santa Barbara. So for infill redevelopment projects within this area, again, the SB 743 allows limited streamlined CEQA processing. The last one that we see in SB 743 that allows more local control is screening or mapping of areas that we want to promote infill affordable housing. If we go to the next two slides, actually. Santa Barbara County just came out with their transportation analysis update guidelines, which really are going to foster in this shift from the standard level of service analysis we used to do to the new VMT. We go to the next slide. So as part of that analysis, they created some residential screening areas in the county areas, both east and west of the city of Santa Barbara. And the green areas that you see on the map are basically saying you can build housing, infill housing in these areas without generating VMT impacts because we're providing a better job housing balance within those zones. So it's just an example of where some of the state's transportation policies can be used as tools at the local level to streamline future development of infill housing. Back to you, Tony.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks. I know that a lot of these laws are new, and many communities are really just kind of scratching the surface of how to implement these in their local communities and how to interpret the laws and all of that stuff. Are you starting to see any unintended consequences from these state laws that maybe we should be aware of? Jason, why don't we start with you?
Additionally unintended consequences, I think both be it the state laws being the stick to motivate and or just general infill development overall. Obviously, there's the overall concern, as always, of just broadly gentrification, depending on the level of values and residents in areas that are seeing substantive new development, and that's always something to be thoughtful and monitor. As well as just physical displacement. We speak of infill. It's also can be referred to refill. There's physical development. Most coastal communities are already built out, and so when new development happens, that means it's replacing some existing use and or building. That kind of goes back to those earlier comments of just public resident concern about change of character, change of place. So I think it always has to be thoughtful of what is the physical form, what is the manner and method that development is going through, the process of getting community input in evaluation, and then broadly just always looking forward to the bigger perspective of what are all the collective community input benefits that are being derived from this new development beyond just the creation of housing, but as earlier referenced to the support of new economic activity that's being spurred by those uses.
Thanks, Jason. Scott, we'll turn to you.
Well, certainly one of the consequences we've heard the most about with the AUD program and some of the other programs that have come out of the state in terms of bonus density and reduced parking is the potential for increased traffic and parking impacts within the neighborhoods that are being rezoned. Parking is probably a big issue. Some of the code allows down to 1/2 space per unit, and other codes require 1 space per unit. So I think there's concern that is that going to work, and how is it going to work? One of the things that the city did to address that is the city of Santa Barbara. In the latest review of the AUD program, that says, okay, look, we have residential permit programs within the city that allow residents to park on the street behind and not get a ticket. And they basically said to ensure that these new AUD units don't make that happen, is we're not going to let them have these on-street parking permits. So people are starting to think about how do we control these consequences? What can we do? Another strategy that we're talking about quite a bit these days, if you put up the next slide, is unbundling parking within these new developments. And basically that says, instead of paying rent that covers your apartment unit and your parking place in the garage, you can say, I'm not going to pay for that parking spot. spot. It's going to save you $150 a month. And so by unbundling parking, we can provide a really strong incentive for these infill housing projects to not have as much parking and then not have as much vehicle ownership. It's a strong financial incentive. I mean, there's other tools that we talked about from the parking management world. If you go to the next slide, mixed use development and shared parking is a very powerful tool to provide less parking and not have those unintended consequences. Providing bicycle parking within the developments is an encouragement. Implementing car share programs throughout the communities where we're having these types of developments, as well as park and ride facilities. So some of the toolbox of items that we're seeing to make sure that we don't have this sort of big parking issue.
Yeah, great, Scott. Thank you for that. And Mack, how about from a water policy perspective?
I'd say in general, the state housing, prescriptive state housing laws that have been passed thus far are primarily focused on limiting local cities and local counties' controls over new development. However, they haven't extended quite into the water supply and infrastructure space. So for cities and county areas that have water districts, those water districts still, in fact, could leverage some land use control over new development projects that I don't think the state has quite thought about in terms of new legislation to address. So it would be a little strange, and it could be a little strange in some areas where the water district is effectively serving some land use role by precluding or limiting new development due to potential water supply constraints or perceived potential water supply constraints.
Yeah, great. I agree with that, Mack. So, we are starting to see some of this kind of push and pull a little bit in trying to implement these new laws. Do you think that these issues are short or long term? Are they just the growing pains of making what we believe and know to be a positive transition in trying to change public perspectives and behaviors? Why don't we start? Mack, we'll go back to you on that one.
Sure. So actually, in researching for this presentation, I uncovered a Department of Housing and Community Development memo from the 70s reflecting steps that local agencies could take to encourage new development. So the infill refill development model has been around for a long time, and we're still talking about it today. It's been an issue, so that it does seem like it's going to be a long-term challenge. However, I think a lot of these prescriptive state laws are pushing cities in the right direction towards reconsidering what they can do to help meet their requirements under either the state's regional housing needs assessment or to accommodate additional residents within their community. So I'd like to think that it's a shorter term problem. However, I mean, if you track these types of issues, you may be aware that basically every legislative session, there's a new amendment to state density bonus law or the Housing Accountability Act to tweak the law to increase the availability of housing typically. And that requires trickle-down effects that local agencies need to consider in terms of updates to their code. So it's a short-term. There's short-term action in this area, but it's going to take a lot of work in order to get cities and counties on board with these types of efforts.
Thanks, Mack. Scott, you mentioned a lot of opportunities for how to minimize these unintended consequences. We always think about the future of parking or of development of our communities in general, and a day that we don't have parking. Is that within the short term, going to become a reality, or how do we start to make efforts and strides toward that within the context of this question?
Well, I kind of had structured my response to talk a little bit first about sort of jobs, housing, and balance. And, we certainly have seen that here. So I think in terms of the short term for our community here on the South Coast, it's going to be implementing the ever-changing mandates coming down from the state, and specifically with the jobs, housing, and balance. If you put up the next slide, it just came out yesterday, so it was really great timing for the conference. But SBCAG just held its first workshop on the Connected 2050, which is the new county's regional transportation plan and sustainable community plan. So this plan is really speaking to guide the future of jobs, housing, and transportation within the county. It identified 3 potential sort of land use scenarios that they were going to dig more into. And those scenarios really speak to this link between transportation, housing, and jobs. And so the first of the scenarios was the transit-oriented infill development, which is really what we've been speaking about today. Let's put higher density commercial mixed use and housing developments on our major transit lines within the county. The second scenario that they're looking at is the North County weighted jobs versus South County weighted housing. And kind of as it implies, providing incentives to produce job producing developments in the North County while providing incentives to produce housing within the South County. And then the last alternative they're looking at in the updated plan is the enhanced alternative transportation scenario, which really speaks to providing significantly higher investments in alternative transportation focused on transit, but also building the program bicycle and pedestrian improvement projects that have been funded. So in the short term, those are the types of plans I think we're going to have to see come forward. And I think, certainly providing an enhanced alternative transportation scenario and a North County weighted job scenario mix is going to help with that question of parking. We're going to see better opportunities to use transit instead of providing the car. I think, we could probably hear from Jason on the economic feasibility of providing no parking. You may not be able to finance and rent the building. So I'm not sure we're ready for that yet, quite the Jetsons model, but I think we're slowly getting there, and these sorts of programs that are being driven down by the state to the regional to the local level are going to help answer those questions in the future. For the long term, question about what are the issues I see in terms of implementing these alternative transportation programs, it's really about how are we going to fund this infrastructure. I just said we've got this enhanced alternative transportation scenario being looked at by SBCAG as part of the Blueprint 2050. Well, how are we going to finance that? Right now, the bulk of financing that we see coming from traffic mitigation fee programs and others of that ilk are focused more on brick and mortar roads, traffic signals, and that sort of thing. So I think that's going to be one of the long-term changes we're going to have to see is this funding strategy to support these new ideas about transportation that tie into housing.
Great, thank you, Scott. Yeah, go into you, Jason.
No, very comprehensive overview from both the other speakers. I just add maybe at the micro level, just looking, I think, this is continually, as referenced, long-term evolution of housing policy, both at the state level of state law, but then at the local level of direct implementation, and at the local level, what we're really closely tracking is really what are the price points that are being delivered on new housing units, the inclusionary housing numbers. Right now it's a 10% set aside for inclusionary units to be provided, continuing tweaking that over time, and then also really seeing the physical form of new development that's occurring. In the case of Santa Monica, what we saw was a large number of developments going to the micro units, so much so that we actually had to put in some provisions into the local legislative powers that would really restrict the number of micro units, because we really want a diversity of housing types. And the developers aren't necessarily always thinking kind of inclusively throughout the community and trying to fulfill a broad range of community needs. And so I think there's a myriad of issues to work through. As referenced earlier, obviously parking is invariably always the tail that wags the dog, both on a very costly element on parking, but there's just this evolution and change of parking demand, mobility usage and needs going forward. And so I think there's also a role for local municipality in the case of Santa Barbara that controls so much parking, public parking in the downtown. How can the city be a partner to help kind of offset, and either find creative ways to provide parking and or just kind of find the balance of putting surface parking lots into production just as a kind of an economic incentive to underwrite the land. There's a housing authority project that's in effect right now that's doing so. So I think this will be seeing kind of a continued evolution, both at the state level as referenced, but then even at the local level of continued tweaks to how we're administering the AUD program, and then addressing these various economic and operational needs.
Definitely. So my last question, before we're gonna get into our Mythbuster type of portion of the workshop, is you guys are sort of starting to read into the crystal ball of how to get to the finish line, or how to minimize these unintended consequences. But what are the things that we should be considering or doing today that can help alleviate some of these issues, that can help us transition to a more integrated type of community and urban fabric, and how do we get there? So why don't I start with, let's go, Scott. What say you?
Okay. Well, in researching some of the issues with SB 743, which I've been forced to do, to be honest with you, over the last 3 months, it's been pretty interesting. Okay, so we've got some new mitigation criteria. We don't have a mitigation program in effect right now to deal with that at either the state, county, or local level. And so one of the interesting concepts that's come up, if we could get the next slide up, please, is sort of mitigation banking for VMT impacts. And I touched upon this on my last discussion on the last question about how are we going to finance this alternative transportation, complete streets, multimodal system that we are going to need to have this infill housing be as productive and efficient and popular as it wants to be. And so this particular concept is new and exciting. It basically allows developers to commit funds to a mitigation bank that can be used for a host of projects within the community or the region, rather than saying you have to go build an extra lane at the intersection on the corner of your development. So CEQA has been amended to allow you to pay into these mitigation programs, even for project-specific impacts, so that your project can move forward. A mitigation exchange program is very similar, where a developer can go in and choose from a variety of mitigation programs or elements, and again go out and construct those, even though they're not contiguous to the site. It gives us a great funding option that we don't really have access to for the types of programs we're going to be looking for in the future, and it provides more mitigation flexibility under the new CEQA guidelines.
Awesome, thank you, Scott. Mack, how about you?
Sure. In the water space, I think the key issues are related to financing of water infrastructure improvements, primarily with climate change looming and increased population, and this critical infrastructure aging across the U.S., but in particular in California. I think the local agencies would really benefit from receiving both state and federal money as a carrot to make infrastructure improvements to improve supply and delivery and efficiency. Aging infrastructure leaks 6 to 25% of the water pumped through, so there's a huge amount of water savings that could occur through that process. There is also, I think, great opportunities for creativity at the local level in terms of looking at cities and water districts to approve retrofit programs or help finance retrofit programs to the extent possible in order to free up water resources for infill development. So I think there's kind of two levels. There's hoping for state and federal monies, and then there's thinking about opportunities for cities to reduce their water consumption with their existing housing stock in order to promote and enable additional refill and infill development.
Thanks, Mack. And lastly, Jason.
Yeah, I'll just add kind of additional perspective in at least in the city of Santa Barbara example. This is kind of the elephant in the room, which is aside from all the policy and legislative conditions and requirements to work through and process, we just have the physical development to permit and facilitate through a timely land use and permitting process, so that there's not just lost opportunity. There's enough cost overall just with land, labor, and materials. If you add, delay of construction, start of construction, and delivery date, if that whole process is years, that's a very unquantified but high ultimate loss of capital and capital endeavor. And so the city's making very concentrated efforts to begin streamlining and creating greater efficiency. Ultimately, there's a stick at the state level for some housing types to kind of force that process. But again, I think the city's wanting to maintain as much local control over the permitting and land use, and obviously design regulatory review process. And then it was touched upon, but there's always this unknown expense until you start getting into the details on any physical development. Is just the current infrastructure and the capacity and the cost to upgrade if it's inferior or outdated or undersupplied in capacity. So that's one, I think, over time for communities that haven't done any substantive infrastructure studies to know what kind of their overall demand capacity level is. That's always to get ahead of that, and whatever role is the municipalities or utility districts can take to proactively prepare for, and ultimately stormwater, sewer, and water are those main wet utilities, and then we've got the unknown, which was the electrical side of the coin. So I think those elements of infrastructure and just permitting process, as much as that can be kind of evaluated and prepared for, would be very thoughtful.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for all these thoughts. I think that's a really good discussion, and gives us a lot to not only think about, but also some things that we should be working on, I think altogether community-wide as we move forward. So I'd be remiss, this workshop is titled Mythbusters, and so with our remaining time, I'm going to be posing some common conceptions or misconceptions, depending on your point of view, to you all, and asking you to respond. Again, I want each of you to feel free to chime in, although I'll kind of pose them to a particular person as I've kind of laid them out. So I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Jason. And the first myth would like your thoughts on, fact or fiction, is new market rate housing luxury housing?
Well, is it a myth that new product comes in at higher price points? No, I think that unfortunately is a reality. As such, I think we're seeing concerted efforts, both at local as well as regional levels, of how to address what we call the missing middle, right? The moderate priced housing. Obviously, affordable housing, there's state tax credits and various financing vehicles and processes to address affordable housing. But this idea that new product isn't necessarily priced at the top of the market, that's unfortunately just a byproduct of capitalism, as we all know. And so again, that I made allusions to the Housing Authority has a product underway currently that is addressing that, moderate priced housing. It's not an affordable housing development. It does have some income brackets, but it's 120% of area median income. And the means and methods to get there is city contribution of city land and underwriting that significantly. And so using that really substantial project cost savings can help deliver a price point. And ultimately, I think it is going to take the partnership of nonprofits in that regard, because unless it's a regulatory requirement, be it inclusionary housing, private developers aren't necessarily motivated to deliver. They can, based upon the overall demand exceeding supply, can ultimately deliver and sell, rent housing at the top of the market.
Yeah. Just a quick follow-up. What do you think about the types of statements that if we don't provide the parking, or if we unbundle it, and maybe Scott, you can kind of chime in on this as well, that may not be, and this is for market rate housing, may not be desirable to everybody in the community, and would therefore you'd see some type of considerable reduction in the market rent for those units if it kind of narrows who's interested in renting those.
Well, I'll start with that, and others can join. I think it's ultimately it's providing preference and diversity for consumers, and any savvy developer, product developer is going to want to have a wide range of product opportunities for the broadest interest in the marketplace. And so having a development that has unbundled parking, just provides that, right? There will be folks that choose not to necessarily rent or purchase a parking because that's just their lifestyle and choice, and obviously there would be an associated cost savings for them. And then there's others that actually may want to purchase, or rent 2 to 3 spaces just because they have whatever equipment or vehicles or whatnot. So I think this isn't one I think that the development community is going to necessarily push against, and I think we should generally be open to, because they're wanting to have flexibility into what the type of products that they're delivering.
I would agree with that. I mean, if we look at the success of the AUD program with its significantly reduced parking requirements, the answer is the developers will build that product and it will be rented. So I think that's proof that this lower parking standard can work. And I think unbundling it is just taking it to the next step to ensure that it's working even better than it was. We first started with mixed-use developments, and parking was assigned. Well, that didn't make any sense because you didn't let that one parking space serve different people during the day. And so we said, well, that's not a good approach. And so I think this unbundling is the same idea. There could be a minimum number of reserve spaces, and if you want anything above that, you have to buy it. So I think we've seen a very positive reaction to it in the development tool for making sure that the parking works.
Great. Thank you, guys. My next myth is for you, Scott. So new high-density developments will create traffic congestion and create traffic safety issues.
Myth, as long as they're put in the right place. So, we've all heard probably Rob Dayton talk about the city's traffic model. I have anyway. And so the city of Santa Barbara did a fact check on this very issue. And so they went out and did a traffic model that incorporated 5 different zones of the city. And that included sort of the upper State Street area, which you would consider completely suburban, the sort of Mesa and Hidden Oaks areas. And they looked at the traffic generation rates of both single family and multifamily housing in those zones compared to what they saw downtown Santa Barbara. And the results were staggering. It was the trip generation and vehicle ownership generation rates for those downtown housing units in the walkable neighborhoods were way less than what we saw in the outlying areas. So I think from the local perspective, we have seen that those types of developments can actually fulfill what they've intended to do, which is less vehicle ownership and more walking alternative modes. And we have a traffic model that does the fact check.
All right. There you have it. Mack, coming your way. Historic water allocations for determining net increase in demand should be based on actual historic usage versus capacity of existing meters.
I would say fiction. I think, as I've outlined previously, right, the historic water demands, I think, are an inappropriate metric for understanding what new development and new water use is occurring, especially in this refill, infill development mindset. Historically, California has overproduced or produced a large number of suburban residential homes. The primary driver of water demand in those homes, 50 to 70%, is landscaping. So these more close refill, infill development projects don't have the same level of outdoor landscaping space. and thus, the historic metrics for tracking how much capacity a new development needs they're pretty much irrelevant based on the fact that new development uses a fraction of the water that old development does.
Thanks, Mac. Coming back to you, Jason. Building high-density housing downtown will revitalize State Street.
My experience is that it will be a major contributor to, and so that is a fact. It'll be a major contributor to support revitalization efforts. It in and itself is not alone. It will be other interventions to help facilitate closure of State Street, improvements to public spaces, some other efforts such as that. But adding housing into commercial corridors is just smart growth for one, and then two, just creates new consumer patterns, new consumer demand. More eyes on the street, greater sense of vibrancy and activity in the neighborhood and the area. So it's been proven around the world throughout the communities I've worked, and looking forward to being a part of it here in Santa Barbara.
Looking forward to having you, Jason. Thank you. Back to you, Scott. If you don't provide parking as part of new developments, people will own fewer cars and won't need parking.
It's a two-edged sword there. So obviously, as we've been talking about today, there's two sides of it. You have to have the alternative transportation system in place, and you have to site the developments correctly. And so if you get off of the grid of the transit priority corridors that we've been talking about, it may not work in terms of not providing enough parking. But I think if you tailor it to those areas that the state is pushing us towards, and that the smart growth principles are pushing us forward, it'll work. So it has to be thought out correctly, and have that alternative transportation infrastructure in place. You have to have walkable sidewalks in order to not want to own a car, and you have to have that land use and the mixed use capacity where the mom and you think of New York City, where the mom and pop shops are on every corner, and you don't have to have a car to go get groceries. So I think Jason was sort of hitting on that. The building the housing downtown with a mix of other complementary uses, and what makes it all work together and reduces the need to have that car.
Great. And our last myth is for you, Mac. Policies creating moratoriums or limits on increasing water demand are counter to our state housing production goals.
I would say that's absolutely true, or fact. I think I like this quote that I pulled from Pete Brownstein at DWR. He's in the water efficiency group. The state has not gotten into determining where growth should and should not occur. We're not trying to reduce California's population or hold it in check as a water saving measure. So I think that's an important baseline framework, that every piece of state housing legislation is about encouraging more housing. We're not looking at water supply constraints as a reason to deny new development and new housing for Californians. This is despite concerns regarding climate change and concerns regarding the previous drought. I think the data demonstrates that urban water demand is going down, and that water supply can be reallocated towards municipalities. And so there's no reason for the water supply resources or water to control land use decision making.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining again. It was a real pleasure to have you and work with you on this workshop. To all of the attendees out there, as Scott said, in Zoom land, thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed the conference, and look forward to having the opportunity to connect with you guys either at the conference or when we get back to our offices and can meet in person. So thank you again.